Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Milnes, and this is my wife, Jan. We did the unusual insofar as a husband and wife, we jointly got together to write two novels. It's unusual for two people to be writers in the same book. I have to make an apology to start off with. I'm 90 years of age, unsure of my feet and legs these days, and I suffered a major stroke in 2004, which took my left cerebellum out, causing me not to have a very good memory. So sometimes the words will come here, but I can't bring them down to here, so I have to read it. I hope you'll excuse me doing that. Jan and I wish to thank you for the invitation to be with you today to share a part of Canadian history that has long been ignored. It is, to quote the presentation, forgotten, the story of the British home children. There is much to tell, and we want to cover as many details as possible in the time we have. So we're going to read from a script we prepared for previous talks to groups, passing the ball, so to speak, from one to another. To let you know from whence we have come, we have interwoven some of our own story with that of the British home children.
We are both British, a detail you will no doubt have worked out for yourselves, and both teachers now retired. Graduating in England, my specialty subject was mathematics, John's was history. We both also had qualifications for teaching students with special needs. In 1967, we had visited Canada, primarily to see Expo 67, staying in Montreal with my brother, who had emigrated in the late 50s. We did some travelling across Quebec and Ontario, quite thinking we were seeing a lot of Canada. Only when we looked at a map of the country did we see our travels had hardly covered any distance. When we finally realised the entire area of England could just about be fitted into Algonquin Park, we realised just how vast Canada is. Regardless of how small an area we had seen, we'd fallen in love with the country and its people, and began the process of emigration. 3 years later, on July 24th, 1970, we arrived in Montreal in the middle of a heat wave and a dock strike. Quite the welcome. We had no teaching positions lined up, and it was our intention to travel across this vast land to the Peace River area of northern Alberta. We knew from interviews in London, England, teachers were being recruited there to teach the Métis children. We felt our special education qualifications would stand us in good stead. That was the plan, and we did actually make it as far as Ottawa. While staying for a few days with my brother, who had moved there the previous year, we saw an advertisement in the Ottawa Citizen seeking a special education teacher in Ingleside. So we figured we'd double our chances and both apply for the position. It surely paid off. I was offered the position, and John was asked to set up a new special education class in Williamstown. So after only a week in the country, we had obtained teaching positions. Within a further few weeks, we had purchased a 200-acre farm property west of Cornwall, close to Long Sault. Things were moving pretty fast. The property hadn't been worked for decades, and our much revised plan was to bring it back to a working farm. First, however, we needed to tackle the home. It had no heat, water supply, or plumbing, although it did have a 3-holer at the back of the garden. As well as teaching, we worked on the house through the winter of 1970, the worst on record. I never thought there was that much snow in the world when we arrived home each day after teaching to find a piled up driveway. In spite of this, we continued on with the house renovations, and when they were complete, we set about adding the animals. Fate had stepped in to find employment for us both, and she was about to step in once more. John wanted to buy some young pigs. Through a chance meeting between John and a young student at Charlan High School in Williamstown, we met the student's father, John Buchan. John Buchan, the proud owner of 2 farmsteads, not only sold us the young pigs, he became a true friend and a tremendous source of advice as we developed our farm. In the many times we were with him, in the barn or walking the fields, he told us of his early years in Scotland and how he had arrived in Canada. John Buchan was, we later realised, a British home child. Here was someone who had faced tremendous challenges, far greater than those we were facing, to find his place in a new country. This wiry fellow, small in stature but with a huge heart and indomitable spirit, was to forge a link for us to begin a journey that, over much time, has brought us to this place and our quest to share a story that needed to be told.
Jan has put you in a picture as to who we are. Now I want to take you back in time to the middle of the 19th century, to Britain, a country caught in the turmoil of the Industrial Revolution. We all know revolution comes from the verb revolve, which means to turn around. Britain surely was facing a massive turnaround. Prior to this, the country had been primarily agrarian. Villages dotted around the rolling green countryside, interspersed with small towns and larger cities. It was a time of what had become known as the cottage industries. If we could visit one of the villages at that time, we would see it was a hive of activity, with folk busy at various occupations. The farmers working the crops in the fields, or milking in the barns, perhaps slaughtering animals to go to the village butcher. The women might be spinning yarn to be taken to the weavers to make into blankets, or to knitters to make into sweaters. Others might be making clothes or candles, or working in their kitchens baking bread and other items. All these goods would be sold or bartered among their own folk, as well as neighbouring villagers in local markets and fetes. Then, often on a weekly basis, the villagers would fill their carts and venture to sell the wares at the markets in the nearby towns and cities. It was a way of life for many hundreds of villagers who worked hard through long hours but enjoyed the peace and social activity that existed. Sadly, this was to change when the cottage industries became the target of the wealthy, only too eager to capitalise on the very profitable products serving the needs of society. By 1850, big city factories had been developed, and so began the mass production of the goods previously produced in the village cottages. This was the dawning of the Industrial Revolution. Quite naturally, the now unemployed country workers of the cottage industries followed the money. They moved into the cities, anticipating they would now find employment in the new factories. Alas, the factory owners, ever eager to make more and more money, installed machines. These did most of the work, thus greatly reducing the need for human hands at the wheels of industry. For many, the dreams of employment were to remain as dreams. Inevitably, the streets of the cities quickly filled with poverty-stricken folk, unable to earn enough money to feed themselves and their families. Now, with too many mouths to feed, a great number of these families were faced with the unspeakable question of how to cope with their children. There was no social system in place to assist the families. Not wanting to have them taken away and placed in a workhouse, where conditions were far from good, they were left with little alternative to take their youngsters to one of the homes or orphanages that were fast appearing around the country. In other circumstances, a family might be torn apart when one of the parents died, perhaps in childbirth or as a result of a workplace accident. Oftentimes, when a new mother or father came on the scene, the existing children were not willingly accepted. These unfortunate youngsters often found themselves simply thrust out on the streets, becoming part of a growing throng of street urchins. For obvious reasons, the street children had a limited lifespan prediction. These unfortunates, the side products of a society imbued with the goal to make the rich ever wealthier, really had little chance of any future. Every day they managed to survive must have been a bonus. Many of them, deprived of normal childhood, knew little about their families. In fact, if asked about their grandparents, they might, with the naive logic of the young, have responded, "We were too poor to have grandparents." Over time, groups of these street children were directed to one of the orphanages or other such homes. This, however, led to the problem for the philanthropists running the homes. They were becoming overcrowded. Now overrun by ever more youngsters appearing at their doors, what were they to do with these already in their care? Eventually, with the help of the British and Canadian governments, a solution was found. Canada was an emerging country with lots of space and in need of workers. Why not send the youngsters over there to be indentured as farm labourers or domestics? Thus was born the British Home Child Movement, a programme that, between 1869 and 1939, relocated more than 100,000 children, ranging in age from 4 to 40 years old, into many parts of Canada. The majority of these youngsters were resettled in Ontario and Quebec. There were more than 50 players involved in the British Home Child Movement. Without listing them all, the significant players were the British government, the Canadian government, Annie Macpherson, Maria Rye, Dr. Thomas Bernardo, William Quarrier, James W.C. Fagan, John T. Middlemore, the Salvation Army, and the Church of England. My apologies. The Salvation Army has been largely overlooked as an agent of immigration. We do know, however, John Buchan was to be always thankful to them for the way in which they encouraged him and paved the way for him to emigrate to Canada.
Although the movement of so many young bodies covered a span of some 70 years, it was for that time a huge undertaking. The unfortunate youngsters were in fact the refugees of that era. They were the collateral damage, not of war zones, but of a country overcome by the sheer magnitude of its poverty. Just trying to imagine the logistics involved in that day and age is mind-boggling. Not for those officials or the electronic devices used today to assist in the current movement of refugees. Every detail would at that time be laboriously written down by hand. The reams of documents would then need to be filed and stored. Not surprisingly, many papers were lost. Incredibly, however, hundreds of documents were meticulously saved and have proven invaluable to today's British home child descendants seeking information. A lot of preparation took place in the various philanthropic homes to make the youngsters ready for their passage to Canada. The children were to be given clothing and other items to take with them, and many homes provided trunks for this. The trunks were not all the same. The different organizations had varying designs and sizes, and the material could be metal or wood. The trunks were mainly made by the boys in the homes. Archival photographs show Dr. Bernardo boys industriously making wooden trunks. Each trunk had the child's name on it, and fastened to the inside of the lid was a list of the items included. We have one trunk on show. It is Dr. Bernardo's trunk, and it's very old, obviously, but any of you are welcome to lift it and see the weight that those young children aged 4 to 14 years carried with them.
And insignificantly, that trunk was found in Quebec.
Yeah. The list of the contents that were included are quite illuminating. There's an example on our table, and I believe you have an example with you. As well as the clothes, most included a Bible, and some, the Bernardo ones for example, included a copy of A Pilgrim's Progress. That's not an easy book for a child to read, as I found when as a youngster it was part of my school curriculum. Whilst the clothing outlined on the list might seem to be fairly comprehensive, it was inevitably far from adequate for the cold Canadian winters. The youngsters were not allowed to include anything personal in their trunks, a favourite toy or other item. This sounds cruel, but it was realistically a necessary edict. Because if you imagine children younger than 14 years carrying a full trunk such as the one we have, that would have been too much if they'd put any other items in. For a start, the trunk, as you will find out, would be heavy, and with the addition of the mandated items, it would become a burdensome object for a young child to manipulate. Some of the first group sent over were even given additional bags to carry, containing dishes and cutlery for use at meal times on the ship, since the earlier ships did not supply such items. This was the norm for the other paying passengers too, nothing like the classy liners many of us have enjoyed. The later ships were better equipped in this regard. A large number of ships were involved in the transportation of the youngsters. Some were older ships once used to carry cargo. Now they had been adapted to carry a different load, a human cargo. In groups of 100 or so from a particular home, the children would be taken to the docks. There they would congregate with other groups to board the ship for a journey to some far-off land. To me, some of the most poignant photographs from the archives are those showing groups of youngsters standing in their regulation travelling clothes. In front of each stands his or her trunk, a box containing all they possessed, their only connection to the place that was once their home. Once on board, standing on deck and watching the only country they had known disappear from view, how can we even begin to imagine the range of emotions for a young teenager, let alone a bewildered 4-year-old?
The British government had set into place minimum standards for the ships transporting the unwanted children in their midst. They set standards for accommodations on board ship, separate quarters for female and male passengers, as well as the quality and quantity of food the children would get on board the vessel. In some instances, the food on the ship would be superior to anything many had eaten prior to boarding the vessel. In spite of all this, however, for many, the crossing proved to be a harrowing experience. With periods of rough seas causing many to suffer bouts of seasickness, there were some who sadly did not survive the ordeal. Once the ship arrived in Canada, usually in Halifax or Montreal, the children were sent to various receiving homes. For some who travelled with siblings, this was the most traumatic part, for brothers and sisters and friends were often separated and sent to different dispersal points. While children were sent to many regions of Canada, the majority found themselves in a receiving home in Ontario. Such homes were Brockville, Galt, Stratford, Toronto, Belleville, Hespeler, and Hamilton. Once these children would be placed with a family, boys as indentured farm labourers and girls as domestics. The placement process was simple. Those wanting to take a child submitted an application to the receiving home. They would then be notified when the children arrived. There was generally 7 applicants for every child.
Wow.
The treatment of these children varied from placement to placement. There were households that saw the children as a source of cheap labour, and others were horribly abusive. There were those who actually stigmatised the very community that was supposed to foster them. The children were often blamed for any bad situations that arose. Others were ridiculed for their odd way of talking and labelled as ruffians or street rats, names that became commonplace. Thankfully, there were households that genuinely cared for the children they had taken in. They treated them as one of the family and ensured they received the schooling that was supposed to be part of the arrangement. There was another method by which the young immigrants might be placed. Arriving in Montreal, for instance, they would be put onto trains, usually the milk train. These would head out each day, picking up the milk cans from farmers waiting at the many small stations along the way. When the train pulled into the station, if a farmer was looking for a youngster to work as a labourer or as a domestic to assist his wife, he would first load his milk cans and then quickly board the train. He would look the youngsters over and, if satisfied, make his choice. It was tantamount to a slave market. Early in our friendship with John Buchan, where he had described to us how he had been put on one of those trains, he was told he had been assigned to a farmer who would be awaiting him when the train drew into Renfrew station. He'd travelled from Montreal to Renfrew. Sure enough, the farmer was waiting for him, and as the train was pulling away, John was eagerly jumped down from the platform. His eagerness was soon shattered when the farmer looked him over and declared, "You're much too small for a worker for me." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving John on the platform and the train disappearing from view. Just imagine how that young fellow must have felt, left high and dry in a strange place with no idea of what he should do next and where to find the money to return back to Montreal or even to Scotland. Whichever way these youngsters found a home, their future well-being became a hit-and-miss affair. Supervision was at a minimum and social workers seldom visited. When a social worker did visit, it was only a cursory contact. For example, the social worker would not often ask to see where the child slept. Few of these social workers, therefore, knew that many of the immigrant children actually slept in the barn with the cattle. Some, such as John Button, were also made to eat their meals in the barn. The social workers rarely checked if the younger children were receiving the mandated schooling. The majority of the younger boys working as farm labourers received little, if any, schooling. It depended on the needs of the farm, on the harvest season, and most significantly on the farmer's attitude. To these unfortunate youngsters fell the task of mustering once again the strength and courage that had carried them thus far. This sometimes included actually running away from the farm or home to which they had been assigned. Should this happen and the child was caught, it was deemed proper to return the child to the home from which he or she had run away. Then, if this did not work out, the child would be moved to another home. Eventually, some, not willing to be treated as slaves, took matters into their own hands and simply disappeared. Others died from ill health or injuries sustained while working. For others, it was a result of sheer neglect or overwork, or maybe excessive punishment for a minor deviance. When World War I was declared, an estimated 10,000 British home children joined up for the Canadian Expeditionary Force, some running away and lying about their age in order to enlist. While some, an estimated 1,000, made the ultimate sacrifice, the others who returned settled down to become useful citizens, raising families of their own. Eventually, many from these families would serve in World War II, again with some making the ultimate sacrifice. Records actually show that 26 British home children, members of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, gave their lives and were buried in England, from whence they came. While the youngsters were indentured, the programme mandated they were paid wages. Part of this money was then taken back, a portion to be given to cover the cost of their passage, and a portion was to be held by the employer. This was then to be given to the youngsters when they were 18 and their indenture ended. At that time, they were free to go and make their own way. Sadly, many never received the payment to which they were entitled. It's hard to imagine how lonely some must have felt when they left their employment. Years earlier, they had arrived feeling quite alone. Even when they came with siblings or friends, they'd been separated from them by the very process that was involved. It is hardly surprising then that many had reacted to their fate by withdrawing into themselves. Rarely telling of their past, they would build a protective wall around themselves. Eventually, when they married and had families of their own, it was commonplace not to discuss their past. Shame had been built into their lives.
So it was with John Buchan. We learnt years after his untimely death that his wife Betty and his children knew virtually nothing about his early life. By then we had retired from teaching, had sold the farm and built a log house just inside the Quebec border, on the water with access to Lake St. Francis. We lived there until 1994, at which time Quebec was in the lead-up to their second referendum to try and split from Canada. The overall feeling was that this time it would succeed. Not wanting to be part of such a split, we decided to sell the house and we went on the road, towing behind us our home away from home, a 35-foot RV. We travelled across Canada. Yes, we even made it to the Peace River area. We found it to be the beautiful place we had envisaged, and the people were most welcoming. Sadly, since that time, they have faced the challenges of fire, flood, and unemployment, but we know they have the spirit and resilience to recover. Our travels finally took us to Baja, Mexico, the peninsula below California. For 6 months of each year, we lived there, building a house on the edge of Conception Bay, a true paradise. Whilst there, we divided our time between building, helping in the local school and its adjacent medical clinic, and working with the residents to improve their environment. For the remaining 6 summer months of each year, we returned to Canada and lived in our RV in a park near Brighton, Ontario. It could be said we were reverse snowbirds, living in a house in the south and an RV in Canada. In 2001, because of a need to be near major health facilities to address an emerging heart problem for John, we sold the house in Baja, Mexico, and settled for the winters on the edge of Joshua Tree National Park in California, 5 minutes from a local hospital and 20 minutes from major health facilities in Palm Springs. Ever gluttons for punishment, we moved a large used manufactured home from Palm Springs onto a 1-acre lot we had purchased in Joshua Tree and proceeded to remodel it from one end to the other. In our breaks from work in the house, I helped in the Literacy for All program at the local library, and John volunteered with the Community Police Services Senior Neighborhood Watch Patrol. In April 2004, when we had finished all but one room of the renovations, and we were due to return to Canada for that year, John suffered his major ischemic stroke. We were told to accept the fact he would never regain the ability to walk or talk. Once again, our lives had changed. We were, however, not willing to accept the edict of the Californian neurologist, and over the following months and year, our waking hours were devoted to, I guess you could say, proving him wrong. As you can see, we did just that. In fact, we returned to Joshua Tree the following winter and finished the renovation.
Wow.
In 2007, again while we were in California, John was hospitalized again, this time in Palm Springs, where he had a stent and a pacemaker fitted. It finally occurred to us that we were being sent a message, that it was perhaps time to return to Canada and set down some roots once more. We sold the house in Joshua Tree and bought a century-old farmhouse near Long Sault in Ontario. This one, however, was a fully modernized home with toilets and on a 1¼ acres rather than 200. By a bizarre quirk of fate, it was about 8 kilometers in a straight line east of the one we bought as new immigrants almost exactly 43 years earlier. We had indeed come full circle. In the process, we had met some wonderful people and stayed in very interesting places. We're happiest when we're doing good for others, and our hope always was that we made some difference along the way and left the places better than we had found them. During the ensuing years, I turned 2 pages. Thank you. During all our travels, we had held tight to the stories John Buchan had told us, and in 2011 we became directors of the Ontario East British Home Child Family. This group of British home child descendants was working diligently, researching their own histories while feeling a need to make the public aware of the important part that young immigrants had played in the building of Canada. Incredibly, this part of the nation's history had not even been included in the curriculum of Canadian schools. The OEBHCF group was spearheaded by Jim Brownell, our area MPP at the time, and himself a British home child descendant. Jim had presented a bill in the legislature that was eventually passed unanimously in 2011 to proclaim September 28th each year in Ontario as British Home Child Day. The date was significant for Jim, since September 28th was the day his grandmother, just short of her 14th birthday, had landed in Canada. That day has since been adopted by the federal government, and it is a day throughout Canada. During the ensuing years, the OEBHCF, in conjunction with Upper Canada Village, converted the original Altesville train station on the village property alongside Highway 2 into a British Home Child Museum. The exhibits in the museum not only give visitors a taste of the children's lives, but standing on that Altesville station platform on which so many youngsters found themselves when they arrived in the area. One can almost experience their loneliness and bewilderment. During our time as directors of the group, we met many people who were diligently researching their roots with British home children. This reinforced a desire to give a voice to these thousands of youngsters who, facing incredible challenges, had become worthy citizens of the country they had come to call home and who had helped in its very development. We were driven to write a book, but how, we wondered, could we catch the interest of the Canadians? We knew there were already books out in the public domain describing the life of a particular British home child, and there were many others filled with amazing lists of statistics. We also knew from our own research how the movement of thousands of youngsters had taken place. And we also had the ace up our sleeve, the stories from John Buchan himself. These we considered would provide the core of our book. In his years as a history teacher, John had always maintained the way to catch his students' interest in a subject that for some was far from interesting was to tell it through stories. By including the facts in with physical descriptions of the historical times, he found the students could feel they were actually part of whatever had happened. So we decided to write a novel that would follow the paths of 3 young immigrants, 2 of them fictitious characters and 1 real-life youngster, John Buchan. The title we gave our novel, Stepping Stones, was chosen to symbolize the challenges the 3 youngsters faced as they first struggled through life on the streets of Britain, then on to enduring a horrendous sea crossing, finally facing and overcoming further obstacles along the way to become valuable citizens. As well as making the readers aware of and understand the reasoning behind the British Home Child movement, we also hoped they would be compelled to walk in the shoes of our characters, to actually experience some of the emotions the youngsters had to face. We had absolutely no desire or intent to use our book to make judgments. The edict, "Judge not, lest ye be judged," carries the implication one should be fully aware of the situation before making a judgment. We cannot come close to imagining the desperation of a country where so many had been thrust into poverty. Nor do we look to place blame on the governments or philanthropists of the time. They had meant well and realistically had saved many children from a premature death. Without doubt, the situation of many of those street urchins was one of despair, where the sheer act of living might mean dying a little every day. Were mistakes made? Could things have been handled better? In retrospect, the answer would have to be yes on both counts. But as stated earlier, the logistical challenges were huge. History is not always good. It's sometimes bad, even ugly, but it needs to be complete. If with our story that we believe needed to be told, we would have indeed given a voice to the more than 100,000 youngsters who helped to build this great nation, we would also hopefully have helped to give them their rightful place in its history.
We published our first book, Stepping Stones, in 2016 and found the audiences at the many presentations we made receptive of our story. We were not surprised at the number of people who had no previous knowledge of the British Home Child movement and the youngsters who have played such a significant part in Canada's emergence as a country. We were, however, encouraged by the few who had discovered they were a descendant of a British home child, and we were able to give them some leads for their research. After finding it necessary to print a second edition of Stepping Stones, we came to the realization we were not telling the whole story. That part of the story would be the young girls who came over as domestics. It needed to be told too. We approached the writing of the second book, For As Long As We Live, in the same manner as the first, covering 1 real life and 2 imaginary characters. Without question, our real life character would be Mary Scott Pearson, grandmother of Jim Brownell. We had not met Mary Scott. Sadly, neither had Jim. And, similar to so many other British home child descendants, he had only discovered the incredible details of her early life by chance. For As Long As We Live was published in the late summer of 2019 and officially released on British Home Child Day, September the 28th of that year. I'm sure we can all remember what happened over that winter, and by 2020 our plans for presentations were shattered by COVID-19 restrictions. It's only recently we've been able to accept invitations to appear in public. We are now given dates for previously arranged presentations. Yours today is our first after it's twice needed to be put on hold. We're now into a new era in an ever-changing world. Our quest to give the British home children a voice is not yet over, and we wish to thank you for allowing us the opportunity to share this incredible story with you. We would now like to read a passage from each of our 2 books. After the readings, we'll invite questions and we'll endeavour to provide answers. These passages are from our first book, Stepping Stones, and they will be from the life of John Buchan. We have carefully selected the passages because we have no desire to spoil the story for those intending to read it. Seeking work, John walked from his home in Glasgow, Scotland, to Liverpool in England. This was a very, very long walk, more than 200 miles, approximately 360 kilometres. And significantly, when he realised he was going to be emigrating to Canada, he walked back to Scotland to say goodbye to his parents, and then back again to Liverpool. It's incredible, the tenacity of the man to walk that far. The road to tomorrow was long, indeed, but the tough Scot plodded on, going ever further south. After Lancaster, the seat of Lancashire County, he passed through Preston, then Wigan, and even the tiny town of Langwathby. John tried to find employment in all these towns, but discovering there simply was no work, he reluctantly made up his mind he would give the next city his final try. His steps eventually brought him to the city of Liverpool, where, with a heavy heart, he knew he would have to face a decision. If this city did not give him a chance of employment, he would likely have to return home to Scotland, even if it meant he would be admitting defeat. Not unlike his native Clydeside, Liverpool was a city built on the banks of a river, the Mersey River. In fact, Liverpool was directly situated on the eastern banks of the Mersey estuary and was a major English northern seaport. As John walked its streets looking for work, almost half of the world's trade was passing through the Liverpool docks. To John, this was just another large English city, filled with unemployed people who walked the streets in ever-growing despair. For the dour Scot, despair was something that had always been in his past, and was perhaps the spur to keep him going forward. Nevertheless, the magnitude of this large city was beyond John's comprehension. Only when he had walked the streets looking for a job or strolling in his evening hours did he realise the vastness of the city. There were endless streets with terraced homes built adjoining each other, or streets having rows of homes with wrought iron fences and wrought iron gates enclosing tiny front gardens. These were not the homes of the prosperous, but they did tell a tale of poor to middle class income levels in this large city by the estuary. John did not look for the homes of the rich because this would have tormented his mind. He knew the homes would be large because this was the manner in which the rich portrayed their wealth. Talking to others he had met on this big city, John learned of a centre run by the Salvation Army, where he had been told he would find a warm place to rest and maybe something to feed his ever-hungry stomach. This proved to be true, and during the weeks ahead, although his pride sometimes got in the way, he found himself enticed, when hunger overcame pride, to take a meal with the generous Salvation Army staff. It was here that John first ate and enjoyed scouse, a kind of stew famous in the area. It was also at the Salvation Army Centre that John found somewhere to sleep, saving him from becoming a city street kid. Although the Scot had lived close to the poverty line, he had never been forced to becoming a member of the homeless urban community. He knew he would be ever thankful for the kindness of the people at Liverpool's Salvation Army Centre and the good-hearted farm folk he had met along the way. Just as he had done when he was on the road, John gave his labours in return for the accommodations and food the Salvation Army afforded him. The young Scot swept the floors, cleaned the windows, helped to peel the potatoes, and took on the outside work. This helped quell his concerns about charity, although he knew fine folk at the centre did not count what they gave. It was not long after John arrived at the centre that the major in charge confided in one of the staff. "Our grounds," he said, "have never looked so good since John took on the responsibility of keeping them in shape." The Salvation Army folk were not only generous, they were always comforting, encouraging, and ready to help those who were down and out, the unfortunates who lacked a stable way of life. Often John would be at the Salvation Army Centre, just spending an evening with young people like himself. They would play card games with cards the Salvation Army provided. Talk was free, as was listening. John often listened to the Salvation Army people discuss a variety of subjects, from religion to politics, or how to help a neighbour. The workers were always kind and helpful. Often they would give the young girls and fellows who came from the surrounding streets a snack before they left for home. However, to the highly independent Scot, no matter how much the good folk made, it seemed as if they were giving because they wanted to, John still considered it to be charity, which it was.
Mm-hmm. My reading from our second book, For As Long As We Live, will also take you to Scotland and introduce you to Mary Scott Pearson, the real-life character. Row upon row of terraced homes now filled the streets in parts of Glasgow, the beating heart of the Scottish lowlands. These homes were joined together with what was called an entry between them. The entry was really a covered-in passage between the homes, leading to the rear of the buildings. It would form a Y at the end, each side leading into the appropriate house. Many rows had a communal backyard in which wash houses and toilets were shared. David and Mary Pearson lived in such a home in the heart of the city. David was an office worker dealing mostly with accounting duties at a nearby large shipbuilding company. He enjoyed his work and was happy he could walk the mile or so there and back. This was good exercise, and it also meant he had little or no cost for transport. Mary was a teacher in the local school. Her workplace was even closer. The school was only a 10-minute walk from their home. A dedicated teacher, Mary was well liked at the school. The headmistress had quickly recognized Mary's qualities and relied on her opinions in many of the decisions she needed to make. The couple's joint pay packets enabled the family to live comfortably, although they could not be described as being wealthy. Their home was small, always neat and tidy, and seemed to radiate happiness. After they had eaten and cleaned the dishes from the evening meal, they would talk about their day's work or sit in a comfortable silence, doing whatever pleased them. David loved books, and he was more than happy to sit reading in his wing chair at one side of the stove. Mary, sitting on the other side, was always busy, knitting or sewing, dreaming of the children they yearned to have. In 1877, her dream came true when she and David became the proud parents of a daughter. They named her Mary after her mother, but added the family name Scott. Her full name was Mary Scott Pearson, and in the family, to distinguish her from her mother, she was called Mary Scott. Life for the Pearson family now seemed happier than ever. Every day was filled with the joy of watching their small daughter grow. Soon after the birth, Mary was able to return to her teaching position, much to the delight of the headmistress. During the week, as soon as Mary was home from school, she would spend some time with her daughter. Then, settling her in her father's wing chair with cushions all around to protect her, Mary would begin preparations for the evening meal. When David came home, he would quickly wash and change out of his office clothes. Then, with a broad smile, he would head for his chair. As he approached the baby, her face would crinkle into a smile while her legs would start moving in anticipation of being picked up. This was his time with Mary Scott, and there soon developed a very special bond between them. Her first word was "da," and once she was toddling, she would climb up into a chair near the window, watching for him to come down the street. As soon as he walked through the door, she would rush to greet him. 2 years after Mary's birth, the young parents were blessed with another daughter. Choosing the name Margaret, they again added the same Scott family name. Little Mary Scott was fascinated with the new baby, never leaving her mother's side as she attended to the new arrival. It seemed now life was complete for this family. They were happy in their work, they had 2 healthy daughters. What more could they want? Fate, however, was lurking in the shadows, and their delight was very short-lived. Only 2 weeks after welcoming their new addition to the family, David became very ill. In the latter part of the century, consumption, or tuberculosis as it became known in later years, was rife throughout Britain. As a result of an outbreak in the row houses near where they lived, David became a sad victim of this scourge. The first signs of the horrible disease were excruciating coughing bouts, through which David suffered without complaint. His wife Mary fussed over him, dreading her fears would become reality. The Pearson family scene was a common one throughout Scotland. In fact, it was a scene replicated throughout the British Isles. Sadly, there were many families without even a modicum of possessions who were absolutely destitute. There was nothing the governments could do to alleviate the pain of poverty. There was no doubt in Mary's mind the time she and David had together was limited. The doctor had decreed David only had, at the most, a few more weeks left before the end came. In fact, it came even quicker, and 2 days later, David drew his last breath, gently settling on his bed. This was the end for the husband and father. A new corner had been turned. While Mary could never express in words the pain she suffered, her face told its own story. In spite of her grief, Mary realized she must tend to the 2 babies for whom she was now solely responsible. She hurried downstairs. As she appeared, Mary Scott, the pretty 2-year-old, her namesake, with an intuition far beyond her years, seemed to sense a change in her mother's emotion. With outstretched arms and a sad look on her little face, she had run to nestle against her mother's legs. From that day on, she never again uttered the word "da." Her life was about to change forever.
I'd like to read you a short piece of how after John had been rejected by the farmer. Seeing an eastbound train approaching the platform on the other side, he quickly crossed the railway lines and boarded it. John prepared himself for the journey back to Montreal and eventually back to Scotland, where he must tell of his failure. Slumped down on the bench seat of the milk train, feeling most disconsolate and quite reasonably sorry for himself, John began the long journey back to Montreal. How, he wondered, will I raise the money to pay my fare back to Scotland? His meagre savings would not be enough to cover that cost, and it appeared most obvious he was not likely to get work. The train continued its message, although it seemed to have changed a little. Now the clickety-clack appeared to be saying, maybe things aren't always as bad as they look. John, however, was not of a mind to find comfort in those sounds. He thought his chances of ever being gainfully employed had zipped out of the window in Renfrew, Ontario. Unbeknown to John, for luck tends to be a combination of unrelated factors, all merging in at the same time and the same place, his future had not been fully destroyed. He was very soon to find solace when the train made one of its regular stops to pick up full milk cans from local farms. The train slowed down as it approached the McAlpine station, close to Van Cleek Hill, on the Ontario side of the Quebec-Ontario border. This was, in fact, not too far from where Benji had left the westbound train, but John had no knowledge of this. He sat, feeling completely dejected, not even looking out of the window. On the platform, waiting for the train to come to a rest, stood a farmer by the name of Mr. Sharp. He had, by happen chance, brought the milk to the station that day. It was a task the farmer's wife normally fulfilled, but he had other things to do. He had other things to do in town, the reason for him being there. He stood patiently waiting so he could load his 8-gallon cans of milk that had to be shipped to Montreal. After loading his cans and needing to kill time until the stores opened so he could buy his supplies, Mr. Sharp slowly walked to the end of the platform. Passing one of the passenger carriages, he noticed a young fellow slouched in his seat, looking very depressed. Being a caring person and feeling very unhappy at the sight of the young fellow, Albert turned around, got on the train, and approached the grim-looking lad. This farmer had feelings and freely showed how he felt. Introducing himself, he invited John to get off the train. Please come onto the station platform and tell me your story, John. The boy, ever fearfully would not be able to get back on the train in time, had to be assured there would be another train coming shortly after that one. With great reluctance and with an extremely heavy heart, the teenager did as he was asked. To the disconsolate youth, this small yet tough-looking farmer seemed to be a good, caring fellow. The judgment of the youth was to be proven accurate. Once on the platform, Mr. Sharp sat down with John. Now tell me whatever makes a young fellow like you, with a whole life before you, look so sad. John, without even looking up, told his unhappy story. I walked the streets of cities in England and Scotland, and because I'm too small and didn't have experience or enough schooling, I couldn't find work. I came to Canada because I understood everything would be different here. It's not different. It's exactly the same. We'd invite questions or just a discussion.
Wow.
When you talked about the indentured boys, were the girls also given money after a certain amount of years of work? or-
Yes, it was a contract that was made between the government and the employers, and that was the standard. They all had to have X amount of money for the time they worked up to that completion of the debenture. And when they completed it, part of the cost had to go back to the shipping company for shipping them to Canada. And the balance, the farmer took out cost of food and so on and so forth, and then the balance was given to the youngsters.
So they would get that when they were 18, I guess?
Yeah.
Yes, many of them didn't get that money
No.
No, exactly.
because the farmers were probably almost destitute themselves. No excuse, but it was still a reality of life.
Dear. That's wild.
So this is a program that ran for 14, how many years? 60 years.
Oh, it went on from 1867 to 1939.
Okay, so under the same indenture process, I mean,
The indenture process was from the time the child began employment until they reached the 18 years of age.
so even, even after how many years, 40 years, they were still following the same process.
Yes,
That didn't-
because you get different starting points. Some of the children were only 4 years of age, some were 14 years of age. So the older children would have less time indentured. But the younger children, and it's hard to imagine that a 4-year-old child being used as a servant in a house as a domestic. It's very hard to understand. We can't see it and feel it in our modern times.
I'd like to add a brief story which sounds like yours. On July 31st, 1890, my grandfather, William James Burns, and who was 12 years old, and his brother, James William Burns, so you can see the documentation getting confused, were placed on a ship in Liverpool, the SS Sardinia. They were brought there by a Catholic priest who took them from an orphanage, and along with many, and they came to Gros Isle in Quebec, and eventually landed in Montreal. They were separated. One came straight to Montreal, worked as a machinist eventually. Another landed in Charlemagne, Celine Dion's hometown. Charlemagne married Albina Lompré and ran a farm there. But I understand when you say for the first time, because I have their trunk, how they said
wow.
very little about what their.
Yeah.
My father was the only son, and it was my grandfather, and I regret to this day that I did not ask more questions. Because I knew nothing really of what happened to them before, or their stay here, or this Father Seddowes who brought many British children here, and their reluctance to say anything about it.
You should not feel sorry for not asking the questions, because in fact, had you asked the questions, I'm sure you wouldn't have got the answers.
Probably.
We only got these stories from John Buchan because as we were working in the barn together, he would tell us something which was related to an incident, and so it gave him the reason to tell us that part of the story. And we collected those stories in our own minds and built up the whole image. But realistically, he would never deliberately want to tell us anything that had happened to him. He didn't want to appear to be crying for himself, you know.
I think, like you
Thank
said,
you
some
for
of these stories, the children were welcomed and looked after, but there were a lot of real horror stories.
Right.
And a friend of mine knew somebody in New Brunswick that came over as a home child, as a 10-year-old, and his first job was to bury a cow. I mean, for a little 10-year-old kid, I mean,
Yes.
he probably
Come
never
from
even
a
seen,
city somewhere.
never even seen a cow, let alone a dead one, and then to bury the whole, how would the kid even know how to do
Yeah.
that?
I mean, some of the stories were absolutely horrendous, the way the kids were treated.
Yeah,
And not all of
because
them had
in
the
this
trunks,
particular
right?
book, one of the characters, she went through a situation where she went to a farm and the wife had to leave the farm and go to take care of a relative who was sick, and then the farmer sexually abused her.
Oh.
You know, those things happen.
And I don't
And
think
then
all
there's
the kids had trunks either, because the little 4-year-olds couldn't have managed a trunk.
They-
Oh, they did. They had trunks unless
But
they
I don't
came.
think,
along.
I don't think all of the homes sent the kids with trunks. Some of them had very little possessions.
I don't know how they would manage them, but
Yeah.
some of them, like John Buchan, didn't have a trunk.
Right,
He
no,
had a
that's what I
kit
thought.
bag.
Yeah, exactly.
The Salvation Army gave them a kit bag, not
Yeah.
a trunk.
Yeah.
And the trunks were different sizes. That tends to be a bit large to some of
Yeah,
them.
that's what I thought too.
But you have your trunk, you were saying, sir.
Yes, yeah, my grandfather's trunk is smaller than that, and we have that. And amazingly, my mother at one point said, "Oh, that's old,"
Yeah.
you know. But
Ah.
I guess my father, you know, it was known as Granddaddy's trunk, but there was no story to it until now.
How
But I
did you
see-
know? How did you find out then?
Well, I have his baptismal certificate.
Oh, so you
from the church.
investigated.
So I knew, and then eventually, we knew that that was the trunk that brought them. And at that time, we thought that they were 12 years old, we knew that. But we didn't know very much about them. But I look at it now, and the inside had exactly that time, and there was a photo of the Queen,
Yeah.
you know? at that
Aw.
time. Yeah,
Oh,
sweet.
yeah.
oh
I
dear.
mean, a newspaper thing printed.
Right, right. Oh, wow.
So my daughter has that now, and I'm gonna make sure she keeps it.
Oh, wow. She
And the
should know
story-
all about it. Yeah.
I know, it's amazing. And apparently in some of the books, there's stories about this priest, Father Sedos, who brought, had a mission to bring many children here. So I'd like to follow him up too.
And how do
Many of
you?
the stories that were written before were about individual children.
Yes.
A family would research where they came from.
Yeah.
We felt that was too isolated. We need to give a broader story.
Yes, of course.
And whilst we had to use our imaginations, some of the elements in there are quite clear. To give you an example, John Buchan was telling us how when he went to bed at night, he slept in the haymow above the milking shed. And he put some bales of hay around, made like a room there. And as he lay sleeping one night, he awoke and could see 2 big eyes looking at him. And he realised that it was a rat. He screamed and the rat shot up. But he said, "I never went to bed again without taking one of the barn cats to bed with me."
Oh.
But those things, it's hard to imagine them. The fact that the farmer's wife didn't take to him and insisted he had his food in the barn. And by the time he got the food in the barn, it would be cold anyway. Just a miserable life that they had.
And were those children only sent to Canada, or did they also go to Australia?
They went to Australia, South Africa, some went to the States even. But the majority of them came to Canada.
Because the ones you hear about who went to Australia were in the workhouses, right?
Yes.
Were housed there.
And they were normally transferred from the workhouse to Australia.
Right.
Yes. There was when we lived in England, shortly after the Second World War, you could get a passage to Australia for £10.
Yeah.
That was an immigrant passage for anyone that wanted to go.
Remarkable.
I think I read somewhere that they've actually now have a monument somewhere in Toronto to the home children.
Yes.
There are, yes. The home in Brockville, as an example, is now an apartment building, but there is a plaque on the outside saying that it was originally a receiving home.
And the one in Toronto.
They have put memorials all across the country on them. In fact, at the Holtsville station, the lane leading to it, it is called British Home Child Lane, and it's the only one that's ever been designated like that. Quite interesting.
The Toronto home even many of the bricks had the names of
Yeah.
the children written on them. I think it was a boys' receiving home.
Wow.
So 100,000, you said.
100,000, or over 100,000.
When you say receiving homes, how many did they usually receiving homes, how many did they usually accommodate? In some families, it may have been able to accommodate maybe what, 4 or 5, was there a limit?
Well, normally there would be, people would be notified that their children were coming. So when they arrived at the receiving home, almost immediately, people would be there to take them away, because there were 7 families ready to take one of these children. For every one of the children available, there'd be 7 applicants. So most of the children went before they would need to be
They
accommodated
have
in
to
the
come into the room, parade, the people who've been invited on a certain day, and the children then would be lined up, and the people would just say, well,
So John, was the availability of these children, or the arrival of these children coming to that particular destination, was that advertised in what,
Yeah.
at the churches,
Yeah.
Yes,
newspapers?
that's the
What
sort
was
of
the
thing that would
communication
happen, yes.
program?
and then it was just like a slave market, you know, they'd ask to speak to one of them, and the child would speak to them, and then they'd go back and then they'd choose someone else. You know,
Imagine the rejection.
The emotions that those children went through must have been horrendous.
In fact, at one talk we were giving, a person who had come over as a British home child was telling us how she had to stand against the wall with 3 other people, the 3 other children had been selected, so the final selection could be made from 4. You know, it was truly like a slave market.
John, my assumption here is that these children were reasonably fit when they left Britain.
Oh, I wouldn't
Not
think
necessarily,
so.
not
No.
necessarily. Some of them were quite
No.
sick, and often those are the ones that died en route by ship.
Was there any investigation into the people who wanted these children? Was there any criteria for these
No,
people?
because you see,
It was based on need then?
well, you have to understand the entire society that we live in is very advanced, and it's primarily because of the efforts of the trade union movement. For instance, boys would have to go up chimneys and scrape the soot from inside the chimney. And most of those children died at an early age because of the congestion created by ingesting the soot. The trade unions stepped in and stopped that sort of thing, and also made it a minimum age when they could start to work. They created standards. Today, I think trade unions may have gone too far, but in reality, without them, we wouldn't have the society we have today. We must be thankful for the way they brought things into a reasonable standard.
It's terrifying to think that anybody could take these children.
Yes.
You know, in this day and age,
Exactly.
whoa.
Well, even my mum, who grew up in the East End of London, knew of kids that were taken away from the mother if she had a child out of wedlock. The kid was taken away and put in the workhouse, and they could have easily been one of these kids that got
Jeez.
sent
Yeah.
over.
And the workhouse was a terrible situation where
All dreadful.
families would go into the workhouse, they would be used as labourers producing goods for manufacturers, but they wouldn't get the pay for it. The people that ran the workhouse got the pay for it, and they were given meagre food. It was a terrible situation. But you mustn't think this only happened with the British home children. There were other incidences of this happening. For instance, around New York City, the nuns collected all the children off the street and shipped them out to the West and put them into Catholic homes to perpetuate the Catholic religion. Nothing wrong in it, but they did that. And then in Switzerland, until very late in the last century, to my knowledge, 1997, the police had the right to go into a home of a single parent family and remove the child without the consent of the parents and put them on a farm. And the reason for it was Switzerland at that time was very short of farm and industrial machinery, and so the children were used as the labourers for it. But significantly, the parents still had to pay for the cost of the clothing for the children and provide food for them,
But couldn't visit them.
but couldn't visit them. No.
No, good
And that's in Switzerland.
Well, I think I have a granddaughter who's a teacher, and I think that she's always been very emphatic about some of the hidden stories of
Yes.
history. This being one of them, or residential schools is another. You know, so
Well, the point about the residential schools is that's being given political
exactly.
light. You know, they actually are telling us about that. But these 100,000 children, nobody knows anything about it. And the government doesn't seem ready to even listen.
No,
I've offered copies of these books to the government,
Yeah.
free,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
to use. And in fact, in Stormont, in STNG, I think, in fact, every high school has a copy of this book and this book, and it's expected that it's part of the curriculum in those schools. But it's the only school board that we've been able to cause it to happen.
I'm reading a book at the moment about the Irish children who were indentured to Jamaica.
Yes.
And yeah, it's called the other side of the, I can't remember.
I think it's the other side of the story, isn't it? The other side of the track, or something like that.
The other side of the tide, the other side of
Yes.
the tide or something. Very interesting, and he's obviously a white kid in Jamaica, and so he has some favoritism because he's white, and so he's not necessarily a slave, but he's been promised that the deals were that after 10 years they would receive 1 gold coin. So he lived to be 70, and was hoping to get his 7 gold coins in order to be able to buy land, but you know, of course, they don't always give it to you for, you know, many reasons and stuff. It's super interesting, but I had never heard of the Irish being sent to Jamaica to work as laborers and you know, essentially the slaves. So, yeah,
So
very
that
interesting.
happened as a result of the potato famine.
Exactly. Well, this kid
And
was
I
sent
have
because
knowledge of that because one of my ancestors was the cause of that, because he denied those people the right to even sleep in the hovels they had. It was a terrible situation. I'm very ashamed of a relative like that.
Is there any documentation of these home children returning to England
No,
after their?
no, not that I'm aware of. I know that
Because they were orphans.
we do know that some did return to England, but not many. In fact, of those that we did know who wanted to go back, never actually made it back.
Most of them were orphans? Or-
Yes, yes. But some of them rose to pretty good positions in life by their own efforts. We know one who became a nuclear scientist. It was quite incredible, really, because they had no early education. And so the fact that they continued to educate themselves or seek education after they'd arrived here was quite significant.
I can't imagine being a 4-year-old. I mean, that's the thing that boggles my mind.
That boggles the mind, doesn't it?
You know, and separated from any siblings or friends or anything like that. So, I mean, I just can't get my brain around that when I think about
I can just
kids that
visually see 2 little children walking along hand in hand,
Yeah, and then being taken.
and then being separated. Horrifying.
Do you have any documentation in terms of the percentage of how many were orphans or just destitute and went on
No,
the street or?
there's never been any decision to break up the numbers, to say some were orphans and some were just
So you don't know?
delivered to
It's
orphanages
just
or
all together, just
philanthropic
like
homes.
institutes.
But there is a program in England that provides, did at any rate. As I mentioned, my grandmother's brother was a homeboy in Canada, born in Oxford, and then returned to, had a bad experience here, but then returned to England and was in the First World War, then married, and then came back to Canada. But a son of his did a lot of research on that father for various reasons, but one of them, he got a lot of support from the British government that gave him a researcher, actually. This was a very this man who sought this information about his father was very, I would say, slightly aggressive, and got these funds from the British government, and had this researcher doing all kinds of work for him when he was, and then we all went over and did some searching ourselves. But it was just, I thought that was amazing that the British government did that for the homeboys.
Conscious money.
Is that what? Whatever. It was very helpful. Yeah.
But when you ask, were these families, was there any due diligence done, if you want to ask? Like my grandfather was baptized conditionally, because they didn't know if he had been baptized. So he was baptized conditionally as a Catholic.
Yes.
And that priest, I presume, brought only Catholic children, boys over. I'm not sure, but I know that they stayed in Grosse Isle. I know that, to be decontaminated or whatever else, and then were brought to Quebec, and they were placed in Catholic homes.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
This fellow was not Catholic, so he did become Catholic, but that was another point.
Not to be a
No.
No, I'm sure my grandfather had no choice in it at all.
No.
But don't think we should take
No.
read too much into the fact that the
Catholic.
Catholics or the Protestants
No.
did certain things. I think they just happened to do it collectively, and
Circumstances.
therefore were building their own strength.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Just happened chance that they kept them in their own field, as you might say.
Just
And as you say, it started off with the best of intentions.
Yes.
You know, they had no way of knowing what was going to happen once the kids arrived here, and there was no follow-up, and that was the real challenge, is the fact that the kids didn't have that follow-up that we would expect today. So.
Exactly. And you know, it's hard to put yourself into the minds of the people of that era. They thought differently to the way we think today.
100,000
And
kids.
when they were sending the children over here, basically it was a wrong thing to be doing. But they saw they were doing it as a helpful thing for the children. And in fact, we believe they saved a lot of them from early death.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, they would have been on the streets. Disease.
Like all
Even if they came here and they were
Like all
abused,
the
it would
twins.
still
I
be
thought
better
of
than
that,
being on the
yeah.
street.
But I can imagine how small some of these farmers were. Like, I think of Renfrew. Well, there's not many big, you can correct me, but I lived there for 5 years, and there weren't many big farms
Oh.
No,
there.
they'd just be.
And there was a lot of rock.
For themselves, really.
Well, when John was working in Eastern Ontario, he was actually working and clearing part of the boreal forest
Yeah.
to make it into fields. And they would cut down the trees, and he said they would plant around the tree trunks that they'd cut down. And over time those tree trunks died, and they could pull them out with the oxen. And they used oxen rather than horses.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
I hope we painted a fairly good picture for you of what the British